Hey, Justine, I'm requesting control just to make sure it's.
Oh, thank you. Yes, sorry.
Work. Yeah. No, that's fine.
I got the other two and then you popped in. There you go. We still have more presenters than we have people in the waiting room, so give them a couple more minutes.
Yeah, hopefully people.
What is this? What is that messenger kids person I keep hearing?
I don't hear that. What's it saying?
How do I minimize this? Because you guys can see this like notification about the waiting room.
Yes.
Okay.
What time are we getting at?
Does that look all right? About 2 minutes?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to cede control back to you.
Once it gets, once we let everybody in, hopefully that'll go away. That's a new one. Okay, I'll start letting people in.
Justine, did you get my presentation? I just emailed it to you indeed.
Okay, let me go get it.
I got it. Yeah.
I'm going to grab a glass of water.
Good idea.
And Justine, I think I'm just going to prefer to have you go ahead and open that up for me. I am having some difficulties accessing it right now on my iPad.
Okay. I've got it.
Close your door while I'm back and then I'll open it.
Keep it closed. I'm going to be on a meeting. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, my clock's showing 8:30, but we'll give a couple more minutes here for folks to start to file in a little bit more. I'm showing 16 at this point. Yep. Justine, does that sound about right?
It does.
Okay. I see Chris Brink. It's good to see you again. Nicole as well. Welcome. I apologize if I can't see everybody. I'm scrolling through here a little bit. There's Mr. McMahon, the great city of Greer. Welcome.
Thank you.
It is a little early.
Yeah, I'll give them a couple more minutes here and then we'll get going. You got everything on your end taken care of, Justine?
I am ready.
Great.
Michael, I say go ahead and start and we'll keep adding people as they come in.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the Upstate Professional Planners, our first remote meeting. little bit different situation, circumstances worldwide than we had the last time we met. So we appreciate everybody's ability and willingness to meet here remotely. I want to thank 10 at the Top for putting this presentation on. I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, Milliken, for helping support this, as well as REWA, our supporting sponsor. We're going to talk a little bit about virtual public meetings during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we think is a pretty timely discussion at this point. I know that this topic was discussed quite a bit in some detail at the National Planning Conference. We wanted to provide a little bit more of a local flair to those discussions. So in doing so, we asked our friends at MKSK T. Coker and Kimley Horn, Jonathan Whitehurst to join us and talk a little bit about some best practices for virtual public meetings. As well, we have David Deerhog with the City of Malden. He is my hometown. He's my Director of Business and Development Services. We just had a marathon session yesterday, a Planning Commission meeting online. And we ran into a couple of challenges along the way. So maybe we can talk about some of that stuff as well, and maybe ways to avoid that moving forward. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to T. Coker with MKSK to get us started. T.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Hi, Justine. I am requesting control. About to share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen? I think everyone's on mute, so either Mike or Justine, if you can.
Yes, sorry. Everyone's nodding.
Yeah, I was nodding.
Okay, good. All right, great. Well, thanks again, Mike, Justine, Dean, for inviting me to speak with everyone this morning. I was told I only have about 10 minutes, so this is, let's see. Sorry about this. I was told I only have about 10 minutes. So this is sort of like a small scattershot presentation. And I'm coming from the perspective of a consultant. And so really most of what I want to talk about is how we address virtual public meetings. And I think we're having to kind of expand our idea of what exactly that constitutes. So just very quickly, I'll introduce myself a little bit in a little greater detail, and then I think we can step back and talk about, what I'm calling a virtual meeting framework, sort of a way to conceptualize how virtual meetings work in today's environment, and then just a sort of quick list based on some recent experience, some best practices and tips. So again, I'm T. Coker. I'm a certified planner. I'm an associate planner with MKSK. We're based out of Columbus, Ohio, but we've got a great Greenville office on Rhett Street. We've been involved in a lot of planning and design projects in the Upstate, including the master plan for Unity Park, master plan for Cleveland Park, comprehensive plan for Greenville County, some downtown master planning for Simpsonville, and some other projects locally. I am from Greenville. Actually, Taylor's is where I was born and grew up, and I live in the unincorporated county just outside of Greer right now, and I went to undergrad at Furman, and I've got a MCRP from Clemson, so as a lot of you do. So anyway, super happy to be here. So as I mentioned, I wanted to take a step back and think about what a virtual meeting framework is. So there's really three components to that. The first is the platforms, and there's a lot of them these days. You have a lot of options. There's three different meeting types, I would argue, and I kind of want to focus on two of them. So I'll just jump right in. So what you see here is not an exhaustive list of platforms that either provide some level of virtual engagement that can either be sort of a standalone virtual meeting or can contribute significantly to a virtual meeting. So, and I guess it's also worth mentioning, is there a way that I can minimize this thing? It's also worth mentioning that over the last 2 weeks, I've used every single one of these platforms. And so it's sort of the Wild West when it comes to the software that we find ourselves using during this public health crisis. I know Zoom has received a lot of press, but for various reasons, privacy being a main one, we're seeing communities and even states like the state of North Carolina has essentially prohibited municipalities from using Zoom for public meetings. And you know, there was an article in the Washington Post a month ago about how Zoom could be construed or seen as spyware, basically. And so, I mean, I guess my point is not that Zoom is spyware. We're on Zoom right now, but it's to say that each of these platforms, they have their strengths, their weaknesses. Cisco WebEx is something that City of Greenville utilizes. I was on a call with folks at City of Clemson, and they use Google Meet. I'm working with Brandon and Ashley and Greer, and so we're using SurveyMonkey and Google My Maps to do some community and stakeholder engagement. And internally at MKSK, we use Microsoft Teams all the time, and we use Mentimeter, which is an interactive mobile based polling system for internal polls. And then there's Facebook Live. One of my former employers, Arnett Muldrow and Associates, who's based out of Greenville, they actually hosted a 3-day conference last week, and they used Facebook Live. So I hopped in on that for a little while. So we have a lot of options in terms of our platforms. As far as the meeting types, you know, I think we could kind of put these into 3 different buckets. You've got your public hearings, and you know, essentially you're trying to replicate those planning commission, those city or county council meetings. You've got to follow those public hearing laws to the best you can virtually. Team meetings, you know, this can either be internal, so whether it's you know, city employees or teams of consultants, or you know, teams of consultants and city or county staff. And I don't really want to spend too much time on that because I don't think it's not as complex as those other 2 options. And then community meetings. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to acknowledge that we can't substitute what happens in a typical community meeting online. So we need to think a little more broadly about how we engage, how we solicit input. And I think there's a number of ways we can do that are fun and creative. So we have a lot of municipal planners in the room. So all of this goes without saying, but basically, if you're a city or county, in South Carolina, according to the Municipal Association, public hearings don't have to be live streamed or broadcast. So that's kind of surprising. My tip to communities would be to live stream or broadcast your public meetings, your public hearings. But instead, you really only have to tick 3 boxes. One, you have to provide appropriate notice. And I think that this cannot be overstated today. I don't think we can just approach this with a business as usual mindset. And whether that means, you know, if we have something that's large and controversial, it may be appropriate to sort of hold off temporarily, or if it's time to forge ahead, we need to think beyond, you know, publishing a notice in the newspaper in terms of how we provide that appropriate notice. The second is that you have to allow members of the public to attend in some form. And whether that's in person or online or a combination of those two, that's a requirement. And then you need to have some sort of mechanism or mechanisms to allow those folks, those attendees, those public participants to provide some comment or input, either before, during, or after the public hearing. And then again, there's a great guide from MASC, so I would direct everyone to their website. But there are really 4 different ways that you can solicit community or public participation. The first is before the meeting, whether that's phone call, an email. Cities or counties can collect those questions or comments prior to a meeting. Secondly, written comments through technology. So, that's what is formally submitted over Cisco WebEx or Zoom or other platforms. Another option is to allow folks to actually speak up, to talk using those technology platforms. And I'll say this is sort of the riskiest tactic, because I know if you read the news, you've seen nationally where public meetings have been hijacked. The term Zoom bombing is something that we throw around now. A year ago, we would have had no idea what that means. And then a callback procedure. And this is something that we don't see as often, or we haven't seen as often, but it is an option for communities. And again, I think it's worth really reinforcing that, we need to make sure that we provide those, not just those required notices, but that we go above and beyond. And I think one thing also worth considering for municipalities is to really allow, to the extent possible, those spoken comments over platforms. And so sometimes that's definitely going to mean that those are going to be mediated. So, but it's very important to consider. So this is just a local example. This is what the city of Greenville is doing right now. And so in terms of providing input prior to a meeting, you can call the city, you can email, and make your comment, your statement, or your question, pose your question to council. And then in terms of how you actually attend or participate in those meetings, there's Cisco WebEx, so you can do it over your mobile phone or your laptop. You can also call in. So there's a conference line function to that as well. And then the city has also made the Greenville Convention Center available for folks who maybe don't have that option digitally to actually attend in person. And so I think, I don't know if anyone from the city of Greenville is here in the meeting, but if you are, I think you guys are doing a great job and setting a good example locally. So like I said, we're going to skip over the team meetings and jump right into community meetings. And so I think it's important to frame community meetings not just as, walking into a room, having your maps, your democracy exercises. It's really ultimately about bringing the conversation about a plan, a project, an initiative into the community. And so last night or 2 nights ago, I was sort of rifling through some of my archived photos to just see what kind of engagement we've done over the last couple of years in MKSK Greenville. And, yes, we did have a hot air balloon ride as part of a public meeting. Actually, it was at the conclusion of a project in Alpharetta, Georgia. Community open houses that are held outdoor that combine, refreshments, activities. I know that probably those kids bobbing for apples jumped out at everyone right away. That looks incredibly dangerous to me right now. But so it's sort of funny to look at something that was not a big deal just even a few months ago, and now it's sort of scary. And then also, you know, community bike rides, ways to really share process. I'm sorry, to really walk community members through a planning process to show, not just tell, ideas and talk about ways that the districts and places can be improved over time. So, you know, how do we really substitute for that? The answer is that we really can't cover all of that, but I do want to talk about one project that we have that is ongoing currently for a neighborhood in Atlanta, the Upper West Side. And so our client is Upper West Side Community Improvement District. And so we're working with tool design and some local planning and planners and designers on a master plan. And so in terms of how we've really construed virtual engagement or virtual public meeting, we've really tried to have sort of a broad toolkit. So the first thing that we set up was a project website, and I know that this is not something that is necessarily new. A lot of larger projects have used websites for years and years and years, but I would argue that if you're starting up a project today, it's almost essential to set that up if community engagement is a priority. Secondly, it's important to utilize some of those existing platforms, whether it's Google My Maps, where you can create an online interactive map. Obviously, ESRI has a lot of products that are going to be useful. And then SurveyMonkey. And again, SurveyMonkey isn't the only online surveying software that's available, but it's important to make those websites interactive from the get-go. And then, you know, how do we go beyond just the digital and bring a project out into the world, again, out into the community? So right now, hopefully we're practicing social distancing. And in the Upper West Side, we actually mailed out over 6,000 postcards to residents and businesses within the neighborhood. And so the postcards serve multiple functions. The first thing it did was it generated awareness, especially for those who may not be plugged into social media or local news. You know, they may not have been aware that this project was going on. So that's a very basic thing. The second thing that the postcard did is that it directed folks to those digital avenues, to those websites, to those surveys, those maps, those sorts of things. And then the third thing it did is that the postcards actually solicited input. And we asked folks to write down things that are important to them within the district. We have kids activities, and we asked you know, parents to essentially have their kids draw in, you know, what they'd like to see in a neighborhood park, you know, other features, and snap a photo and post it on Facebook, on Instagram, tag it in an appropriate way, and then we will collect all of those things. And then the one last thing that we did as part of this postcard project is to set up these small mailboxes within the district. And so if you fill out your postcard, you can you just have general comments, you can drop those off in these small mailboxes. And I believe there's 5 of them throughout the district. And so it's sort of an analog or you know, a physical extension of what we're trying to do digitally. Similarly, we're using yard signs to solicit input via text or SMS. And so, you know, I know during the primary season, I received a lot of text polls, and this is something that's becoming very, very common. And so being able to integrate that into planning process as part of that virtual engagement, it's a relatively easy thing to do. And then virtual workshops themselves. So for this project, we're using Zoom as our platform, and we've conducted a series of virtual workshops, both with the client and selected stakeholders, as well as with the general public. And so I think it's important to stress that these workshops require just as much work beforehand and management during as your typical in-person workshop with the posters and the dots and the sign-ins and all of that. And in fact, I mean, we actually, we probably over-prepare for these, but we always have at least three different jobs assigned for these virtual workshops. We have a facilitator, so the person who's leading the overall conversation. We've got the technology guru or supervisor who's making sure that not just Zoom, but that Google My Maps, the SurveyMonkey, that Mentimeter, that those are all running properly. And then we also have folks who manage the stakeholders or the participants who are managing those chat rooms, who are managing those folks who are waiting in the foyer for entrance. And so it's great if you actually have multiple people who are leading that. And then within the job of facilitation, you even need to have, if you have breakout rooms, for example, you need to have folks who are facilitating conversations within those breakout rooms. And so there's actually a lot of work that's involved in it, a lot of coordination. And, as we think about activities within those workshops, one thing that we're finding that's kind of easy to do and easy to sort of show back to participants are these in-workshop polls using Mentimeter. And so you basically hop on a website on your mobile phone or on your laptop, and you respond. And so with the example of Upper West Side, you can sort of select what ideas are most important to you as far as being able to promote in the plan. And so just a very quick list, and Justine's asking me to wrap it up, so I will. So just a few kind of really basic things. And I'll say, this is based on my experience just over the last couple of months. Make sure you have the right software platform for the job, and make sure that you and your team have the right software. Last week I was in an interview, and one of our team members didn't have the right software because he didn't have the right browser to download it, and so he just wasn't able to participate. And so that kind of thing shouldn't happen. Prior to a meeting, make sure you have a detailed agenda, but go above and beyond and explain how the software works. It's even worthwhile to have some sort of frequently asked questions. You can go ahead and tack that on to an email or PDF. Again, I mentioned assigning roles. The day before a meeting, it's also always great to conduct a trial run. You don't need all of your staff to be on the line, but you at least need to run through things together as a team. To prevent Zoom bombing, make sure that your settings are set to the appropriate controls so that just regular folks can't just hijack a meeting. As far as Zoom and other conferencing services sort of demand on the internet, it makes sense to go ahead and start meetings, either prior to the top of the hour or 30 minutes past. And then I guess just the one last thing is that we need to keep in mind that any sort of platform-based meeting needs to be supplemented by other engagement, and then dress for success. So I have a 3-year-old who's about 20 feet away from me, and I may have to hop up at any point in time. So it's good to be dressed and ready for a meeting, for a presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and Justine, I'm going to let you take over.
Thanks, T. We appreciate the comments. And just real quick, if you didn't see the chat function at the bottom there from Dean, anybody that does have any comments or questions, we're going to have some time set aside at the end of this meeting. So go ahead. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box and we will get to them once all the speakers are done. So next up is Jonathan Whitehurst with Kimley Horn. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot. I am getting the screen ready here. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Real quick, a little bit about myself. I work with Kimley Horn in our Charlotte, North Carolina office, and that office is where Kimley Horn's National Mobility Solutions Practice Group is housed in, and I'm part of that. My focus leans a little bit more toward the integration of land use and transportation, and that's occurring at a variety of scales. And within the Upstate, recently, I've been fortunate enough to work on the Horizon 2040 long-range transportation plan. T was a part of our team for that project, as well as the Greer Community Master Plan, and of course, Connecting Our Future that we did with 10 at the top. So very, very happy to be back in the Upstate, if only virtually. So those that know me know that I take a lot of things seriously. Myself is not one of them. And so, I needed a haircut, and so in mid-April, I convinced my loving wife to let me get a mohawk, and the mohawk lasted for 3 days before my 9-year-old daughter finished the deed and gave me the haircut that you see now. But I do think that this kind of I guess captures kind of what we might have all been thinking in mid-April, especially for those of us that kind of have a public face to what we're doing. It's like, oh no, what is going on? What are we going to do? And so I just wanted to kind of share that. And as you can see, I knew all along I wasn't going to be able to pull off a mohawk. And so the mohawk is no more. So I'm going to take a little bit different approach to this topic. T did such a great job of kind of teeing up some of the kind of the tools that he's used, and what I'm going to talk a little bit more about it is, I think, higher level and more philosophically, kind of how engagement during this time that we find ourselves in is maybe different than what it was before. And then in some cases, it's not different at all. It's just a matter of how we manage the situation. So from an engagement perspective, and T touched on this, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to kind of this piece of your planning process. And so when we go into these processes, we typically really talk about the objectives. What are we trying to achieve from an engagement perspective? And we challenge our clients and to put that in writing, to be able to point back to that throughout the process, to make sure that you're never losing sight of what those objectives are. And that's really important, as there's disruptions that have occurred over the last couple of months and likely will continue. But those objectives can mean a variety of different things. It can be the number of participants. We want to engage with 5% of the population of Greer. It could be the quality of input, making sure that we are able to kind of point back into the planning process and show participants the influence of their participation. In a lot of communities, it's that have a diverse geography, like the 10 at the top region. It's about geographic representation, making sure that we're not leaving kind of the different geographies behind. And then that's also true from a demographic perspective. I think you also need to know kind of what are the threats that are kind of lurking in the shadows. Some of those you know, and some of them you don't. you know, the statutory requirements, like what is the requirement as it relates to engagement? Is there community distrust that is kind of percolating around this particular topic or this particular geography? And then what are the potential schedule delays? And when we say schedule delays, it could be that the inability to meet a meeting objective to kind of cross that that hurdle could delay not just the schedule of the project, but if you're talking about infrastructure, you know, eventually delay the schedule for actually having dirt being turned and seeing those improvements. And then you'll hear me talk a lot about kind of where you are in the planning process. Engagement is just inherently different if you're at the early part of the process where it's about visioning and values and needs assessment, or if it's at the end when you've kind of gone through the process, you've got your plans in place and you're just trying to get that community head nod, if you will. So understanding where you are in the planning process is critical, particularly as we kind of stepped into the disruptions that started to occur in late March. So, you know, when I think of COVID-19 and the disruptions that it's caused, I really think that it's occurring kind of in three stages. One is the crisis. The crisis is you know, when we weren't sure what we needed to do or how we needed to do it, and instead we just went out on the deck and we gave ourselves a mohawk. So that was the crisis. And then I think what we're finding is probably sooner rather than later, this crisis phase is going to go into what I've called the unknown, and that's where we don't really know kind of what's coming up, you know, and the real challenge with the unknown is that communities are opening back up for business at different rates and in different ways. And so in one community, you might be able to host that in-person meeting. In another community at the same exact time, you're just not going to be allowed to do that. And so dealing with the unknowns is going to be really important. And you see kind of in that timeline, that crude timeline at the bottom, there's that blue bar with the question mark. And that's because I think in this period of the unknown, it's potentially, we're going to have another crisis, right? You know, they talk about the second wave. Well, that could be the next crisis. And so what can we do right now to learn from an engagement perspective? What tools work for us? What tools make us want to pull our hair out? And kind of catalog that so that if that second crisis hits, we're better prepared than we were in late March and early April. And then eventually, you know, the crisis and the unknown is going to give way to what I'm calling the new normal. And I challenge anybody out there, if you can come up with a better phrase for the new normal, I am all ears, because I don't necessarily like it, but that's what's on your screen. But I think that the new normal is when we're going to be back in a situation where those in-person meetings are allowed. You know, people are going to feel safe and comfortable engaging in that. But maybe we learned that people are just as likely to engage in kind of that virtual environment. And so suddenly we have kind of this blend where we're not going back completely to where we were. And instead we're kind of infusing some of the lessons learned that we've kind of gathered throughout this process. And the biggest challenge overall is it's not like somebody's going to be able to reach out to the planners of the world and say, congratulations, we're no longer in the period of the unknown. Welcome to the new normal, right? That line is blurry, and we just don't know when that's going to happen. And indeed, it's going to be, you know, happening at different paces for different communities. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and then offer a few tips. You know, from a challenge perspective, and I mentioned this already, where we're at in the planning process matters. And so I think that's really important for us to know, particularly when we're kind of in the midst of the current crisis or any potential crisis. Because, you know, if you're early in the planning process, you probably have a different set of tools and techniques that you can use to make sure that you're maintaining progress on your planning processes. Whereas if you're in the middle and it's really where critical decisions are being made, and making those decisions in the perceived vacuum without adequate community engagement, those decisions are going to be called into question at the end of the process, and that's certainly not what you want to have. And then at the end, honestly, I think the end of the planning process, when you're looking for those community head nods and final bits of input, is probably the easiest type of engagement, easiest point in the planning process to manage going forward. I think when you think back to late March and through early April, I think within the realm of the professional planners, there was this thought that if we just took our in-person engagement and made it virtual, we're going to double our participation because people are captive in their own spaces, and so we kind of thought that if we launched an online survey, we'd have record participation. I think what we're learning is capturing the attention of the public is not easier, and in some cases it could be even harder. And I think that's really important to note, that if you had a public meeting planned at City Hall or wherever, and you just were to say, well, we're going to make this a virtual meeting, that's not necessarily going to be an exact recipe for success. As we start to really kind of go toward virtual or digital engagement, I think we have to prepare ourselves that kind of who we're engaging in those moments is likely going to be scrutinized. There's a lot of talk about the digital divide, and it was interesting that the question that Sierra posed in the chat room was kind of, I think, touching on that, and how you kind of capture the attention and get people to participate is going to be a really important consideration. And that's why kind of that last challenge that you see on the screen is really important. And we tend to focus on kind of the techniques and the strategies. And, I think there's a lot of information kind of weaving itself through the marketplace in terms of what techniques might be right for you. But at the end of the day, there's less of a conversation about which of those techniques fit most neatly into kind of the overall strategy that hopefully you had in place before things started to go awry. But if not, hit the pause button and figure out kind of what those objectives are and what the strategy needs to be to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. And that's where some of these tips come into play. So I think, we always want to define success, and that's where we talk about making sure that you know what your objectives are, not just for the overall planning process, but really from an engagement perspective as well. And it's okay to kind of redefine what that success means. You just want to make sure that you're being transparent about kind of how you're redefining it and what your thought process is. In all of the projects that we've worked on in the Upstate, one thing that we know is there's a lot of good planning that occurs in the Upstate. And so we encourage folks to kind of mine those previous plans for relevant data, particularly as it relates to vision, needs, anything that would come out of an engagement perspective. So really kind of taking a step back and making sure that you're kind of leveraging the good work that came before you. I think T did a good job of touching on the need to kind of be flexible with your process. I think that in some of our bigger plans that we're working on in Dallas, Texas, and elsewhere, it was important for us to not let the process slow down, even if we weren't quite ready to move forward with some of the specific engagement touch points that we wanted. And so there's no reason that in a lot of our plans we can't pull some of the technical exercises ahead and kind of do those either prior to some of those engagement activities or concurrent with. So really just being flexible so that you can maintain progress. You know, we talk about getting to the point quickly, and that obviously goes back to kind of the distractions that are out there, and so I think that getting to the point is important, kind of within the context of a specific engagement activity, but at the end of the day, it's also really important, you know, within the activity itself. So if it's a virtual meeting, if it's an online survey, whatever the platform that you're using, make sure you get to the point quickly so that you don't give folks a reason to kind of chase a squirrel off the screen and never return to the process. We typically make a distinction between virtual and digital engagement. So when I think about virtual engagement, I think about kind of what we're doing right here, kind of this point in time. We're all here together, interacting with one another, but you know, not face to face, in a virtual way. But that contrasts with kind of this overall digital engagement, within which virtual engagement would be a piece of. And you know, digital engagement has been long part of our planning processes. That's making sure that we have a clearinghouse of information online with the project website. Is that if we have a paper survey that we want to, you know, reach out to community centers with, or senior centers, that we have kind of that digital component. So you'll hear us talk a lot about kind of that difference between virtual and digital. We talk about celebrating results and talking numbers when possible. So we're doing a land use plan for a community on the outskirts of Charlotte, and we had a public workshop scheduled for March 19th, which, if you look back, is probably the exact worst time that you would want to schedule a public workshop. And so on you know, March 11th, you know, I sent an email to the planning team there in Mount Holly and said, look, we don't know for sure that this meeting is going to be prohibited. That order had not come down yet, but we need to go ahead and start planning for that to happen. Luckily, we were at the end of the engagement, or end of the planning process. We had our draft land use plan, our draft focus areas, those kinds of things, and we were just trying to get some input on that. And so we took that in-person open house and just turned it into an online survey using the MetroQuest platform. And so we were able to build that. We launched it the week after the survey was supposed to occur. But then we started to talk about how that was successful. And we were able to kind of speak to, you know, the numbers of 400 participants on this survey compared to, you know, the average of 50 or 60 folks that came to our in-person meetings, and talk about the data points and the number of comments that we generated, and really, you know, celebrate that as a success, not as, you know, a bad thing, if you will. We also, you know, words matter, so we didn't talk as much about we had to cancel the meeting, but you know, we replaced this meeting with an online survey. The last thing there is that, you know, seeking out partnerships and guidance materials. I was shocked / not shocked at how fast my inbox got flooded with kind of the sales pitches of kind of these digital platforms. And I think you really have to understand that, you know, a lot of the info out there really is, you know, a sales pitch, because they're trying to capture more of the market share in the digital engagement universe. So you just have to be careful about that. That's where, you know, knowing your strategy for engagement, kind of how your community is going to react to kind of the different options that are out there, and kind of making informed decisions. So just talking real quick about a few best practices. We really think that an engagement diagnostic is really important, and that's a fancy phrase or a fancy term, but it really means two things. One, we want to make sure that from an in-reach perspective, so looking within City Hall or your staff and elected officials, you know, what is the appetite for engagement? What are folks hoping to achieve from the engagement process, and really documenting that. And then the second piece of that diagnostic is making sure, again, we go back to the good plans that came before us and make sure that, we take advantage of that. Back in the Mount Holly example, there was a strategic vision plan that came before us that did an online survey. It was only 2 years old, so we made sure that we kind of used those results to the best of our ability and didn't try to confuse people with the same conversation just 2 years later. I think it's really important as we think about the distractions that are out there, that if your community or if specific planning processes have a brand, to really leverage that brand to kind of cut through the digital clutter. And an effective brand would do that and allow it to kind of carry forward that plan through the process and then kind of on beyond after that. We talk about giving people, multiple ways to engage. People are going to continue to engage in planning processes in ways that are most comfortable to them. And so I think as we start to think about where things will be once things start to normalize, if you will, we're going to have to really continue to make sure that if people get comfortable engaging virtually, that we give them the option to do that moving forward. And then the last piece there is really just kind of be transparent, and that transparency is important, before an event, during the event, and after the event, and that takes on a little bit different flair dependent upon where you are in that event process. So making sure if it's before, that you're really clear about the objectives that you're trying to achieve. And if it's at the end, making sure that, as Justine has done, that the virtual session is being recorded and being made available. So just kind of adhering to that transparency as a best practice. My time is short and I'm already talking fast. So I'll leave you with just a couple of more slides. The first, T talked a little bit about this in terms of meeting types. I think that there's types of virtual engagement. There's the digital surveys, the Survey Monkeys, the MetroQuest that are out there. And those are really kind of those point in time engagement activities. There's the virtual meetings. So, T talked a little bit about the charrette that they did in a virtual way. And then the last one is what I'm calling post and wait. And that's what we're doing for the land use plan in Chapel Hill, where we're at the end of the process. They were kind of unsure if they wanted to do a virtual meeting, a virtual open house, or some other way. And at the end of the day, what we did was we're using Conveo to post all the information about the plan and really just wait for those comments to come in and kind of address them offline, if you will. Between digital surveys or virtual meetings or these post and wait sessions, I don't think one is better than the other. They're just all achieving something slightly different in the overall scheme of things. So a few parting thoughts. I'm sorry I've said objectives so many times, but please, clearly state your objectives, revisit them if you need to, but be transparent about that. Be flexible within those planning processes so that you don't kind of lose steam. Communicate often and frequently and be clear with what you're trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, celebrate the results, even if that means you go up in a hot air balloon. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Looking forward to any questions that come out of this, or if there's a need to follow up with me directly, there's my contact information. Several weeks ago when this was first happening, Kimberly Horn kind of convened a national group from around the firm to look at digital public engagement. And so one of the outputs from that group's work is posted on our project or on our company website with the digital public involvement tag there. So you can learn some best practices. One of the nice things about that is we kind of went through and tried to understand what the different tools were, and what they did, what they didn't do, what was the cost associated with those, what was the limitations, all of that. And so there's a nice toolkit that you can download from that project website as well. With that, I'm going to take a sip of water.
right, great. Thanks, Jonathan. We appreciate that. I'm going to kick it over quickly to David Deerhog with the City of Malden. I just want to make, we're running a little short on time, so I just want to make everyone aware that all these presentations will be available on the 10 at the Top website once this presentation is done. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
All right, and thank you, Mr. Foreman. I'm waiting for, there we go. All right. Boy, look at that handsome devil there. We got, I guess Jonathan shared a little before and after picture of effects of COVID-19 on him. So there's my before picture, and you can see the video feed of me after. You can tell I've still had access to my barber, thankfully, and I'm in good shape. But I'll just share briefly about me. I've been a part of the Upstate beginning in 2003. I attended Clemson University, did the MCRP program like T did. From the looks of T versus me, I venture to guess I was probably there much longer ago than he was. But I worked for about a decade at the city of Simpsonville until I figured I did enough damage there. And then I made a really far away move to the city of Malden and figured I needed to start over and see what I could do here. So I'm working in Malden now. And I just wanted to focus today on sharing our experience. We heard Jonathan mention that there's not really a one size fits all to public engagement. I would say even the same applies to conducting remote public meetings. I know that I've seen a lot of communities have responded in different ways of how they hold and conduct their public meetings. And I will venture to say that they probably may be doing it better than we are. As far as any takeaways you might have from what I share, you may take away more of things not to do than what to do, but I'm still gonna go ahead and share experience. We're still learning about the availability or the available technology, at least I am. Go ahead, next slide, Justine. And I'm just gonna say real briefly here that we know there's in local government, in planning, there's legal parameters that we work within. So I would just say that if you have access to attorney, whether it be like your city attorney, county attorney, or your agency has an attorney, to work with them on how to best navigate this. We worked with our city attorney who drafted an emergency ordinance that allowed our city council, our boards and commissions to conduct remote meetings. All right, let's go to the next slide. And T already showed you a slide that had a sampling of different products and platforms out there. Here's an even smaller sampling. I just want to say this, that there are a lot of products out there that to consider, to use. When we first started out, the city of Malden, we actually started out using a product called Collaborate Space, and that didn't work out so well. We had a lot of streaming issues, and after the first experience with that one, we quickly pivoted. We've used different products with our city council, and we've used different products with our planning commission. Our city council has pivoted to using WebEx, and they use WebEx meetings. With our planning commission, we tried out GoToWebinar actually at first, and after we ran through our free trial, we pivoted and tried out WebEx events last night, and I'll talk about those in just a second. But we did a lot of practice sessions trying these things out before we even did it especially after the experience with Collaborate Space. We realized we got to really try this stuff out first and see how it works. So we did practice sessions with staff, even with family, with friends, just to explore as much of it as possible so that we had some level of comfort when we actually turned it over and did a public meeting using some of these platforms. So I would just say, if you're still looking at different products, try them out with the people at your disposal. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. Right or wrong, as COVID-19 set in and we were trying to look at what adjustments we needed to make, our intent overall was still to maintain as much consistency with our standard procedures as we could. We wanted to keep some familiarity with how things were going. So it was just not turning everything upside down on its head for people. So a lot of our rules and procedures are still, we are following and applying as far as how we hold our public meetings and how we process applications that go to public meetings. But let me talk about the adjustments that we made, and we'll go to the next slide now and talk about some of the adjustments that we needed to consider as we were starting to navigate the response to COVID-19. When it comes to our public notices, because we had switched to holding virtual meetings, remotely accessed meetings, we realized that in our notices for the public that we needed to include instructions on how to join meetings. So we would post those instructions at a space online where that people were directed to, where they could understand how to join the meeting, that there was different methods of joining, whether it be by a mobile device, by calling in, by joining via computer. We also put on our signs that we post on properties notices that they were virtual meetings, so that it was hopefully clear that it was not a come to City Hall meeting, it was a virtual meeting, and the sign directed them to our website where they would know how to access that virtual meeting. I think it may have been T who mentioned that there's some new roles involved with virtual meetings, and we realized quick that one of those new roles was having a meeting administrator, someone who actually is hosting the meeting and running the software and changing whatever settings or responding to whatever they need to during the meeting. For our planning commission, staff has been filling that role as a meeting administrator, and for our city council, we have kind of a resident IT specialist in our police department who has been filling that role. You know, the question came, now we're starting to use webcams. Who can use webcams? Do you control that so only the body of the council or the commission or whoever it may be uses webcams? Do you limit the public from using webcams? You know, that's a decision that each agency is going to have to make. One of the things that we do it differently. We do it differently for city council compared to planning commission. City council lets everyone turn on their webcam still, public and staff alike. Planning commission, we have restricted that to just the members of the planning commission and staff. I think one of the things you have to be aware of is I've seen in our city council meetings, there are sometimes some awkward moments of what you see happening on other people's webcams. It's kind of entertaining, if you will, in some regards, watching what other people happen to be doing while they're watching a public meeting. But it's something that you ought to take into consideration. We wanted to make sure we understood different etiquette that we should follow with using microphones, who can control their microphones, encouraging people to turn off their microphones when they're not speaking. And then the problem I always have is remembering to turn on the microphone when you do start speaking. So again, learning some of these things. Public participation. It's a little different when on these virtual meetings, and we found that we need to help orient the public how that works. We have allowed people to send in written comments beforehand. They typically email those in. We have our phone number posted that people can call us, and they could call us before all this also. But people will call us to ask questions, and we ask them if they have any, when they do call in and they're asking about it at the end, we'll ask them if they have any comments that they wish us to share on their behalf during the public hearing for whatever the item is they may have called about. First, our planning commissions, you've seen on here on Zoom that they've had a chat feature. We've turned off our chat features for the planning commission meeting just because we're trying to stick with the same type of procedures that we had before, and we tried to avoid and refrain from debating and back and forth dialogue during public hearings. So, but there are other settings where that's a great feature when you do charrettes and other public engagement planning efforts. So it certainly has its appropriate place. We have used webinar platforms as well as meeting platforms. Our city council uses meeting platforms, and it comes with a set of challenges It's been hard for our meeting administrator to control everyone from turning off and on their mics at will. But we followed a webinar platform for our planning commission meetings, which does give us a lot more ability to control people's microphone access as well as their webcam access. And we can pretty much keep that turned off until we want to. We'll turn it on for the applicants when they introduce their items that's being considered for public hearing. And then as each member of the public indicates by raising their hand on our platform, we can turn on their mic so they can begin speaking. If you'll go to the next slide, just to show you here, this is one of the things we've done in our latest meeting is to actually show people, and we're exploring more and more how to use the screen share, but we're showing people actually how they can participate, where they need to go to raise their hand during the public hearing so that we can turn on their microphone. We've also been sending tips to our planning commission members in preparation for these public meetings, these virtual public meetings, so that we help the meeting proceed in the best manner possible. For the most part, it's been a pretty good experience. We did run into one challenge at a public meeting last night. There was one person who was wanting to speak and they were having technical difficulties on their end and not able to access their microphone. I'm not sure if they were set up with a microphone, to be honest with you, but other than that one experience, so far we've been able to accommodate just about everyone else who's wanted to participate and speak at these public meetings. So I think for the most part, the experience has been mostly good for Malden as we're learning and navigating this stuff. Last slide, if you will, Justine. You know, a big question for us is moving forward, how do we need to change the public meeting experience? And this is, I think, a question that still merits a lot of discussion, and I don't have the answers for this. But I do expect our in-person meetings to resume. We have a lot of eagerness from some of our city officials to resume in-person public meetings. We may be starting that up sooner than later. Of course, that will come with modifications to how we lay out and format our meetings in our council chambers. But I think one of the things we're recognizing is that there's an opportunity to enhance our public access to meetings. We're including in our budget for this next year some enhancements to our council chambers that'll give us more ability to live stream that and host people in other ways besides physically attending the meeting. And I think there's also opening, at least my eyes, to some new ways in which we can engage the public for public planning projects and efforts in a way other than them physically coming to a meeting. I know we've had SurveyMonkey and stuff like that in the past that we've been able to use, but just seeing and experiencing some of these other products now has really been a great benefit to see, and I'm eager to explore using that with more public engagement processes. So Mr. Foreman, I'll turn it back over to you, but I sure appreciate having a few minutes to just share our experience that we've had with this in the city of Malden.
Phil, you want to go ahead and bring this home? David, we appreciate your time.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for your participation today. Thank you specifically to our presenters, David, Jonathan, and T, and to our sponsors, and of course to 10 at the top for hosting us today. We've run a little bit over this morning, so if you have to leave the meeting, we certainly understand that. I wanted to remind everyone that the presentation will be available on the 10 at the top website in the next few days. We do have a few questions, and if you have some questions that you'd like to put up, we will try and get those in. But we have two questions here. Sierra asks, what options have you found for people who are unable to attend meetings, public or virtual, due to quarantine, work, childcare, etc.? And we've kind of touched on this throughout all three of the presentations. And I want to add just another spin on this, but how do the attendance rates for virtual meetings compare to in-person meetings pre-COVID? What has been your experience with that?
I'll go ahead and jump in here. This is David. And I'll say that I was expecting that we would see increased participation because people could sit from the comfort of their own living room to join a meeting or watch a meeting. I'm actually finding that the participation rates have largely been about the same as we may have expected before COVID-19. We actually had a subdivision project come before the Planning Commission last night, and normally this would have been a project that would have brought a large attendance to our council chambers. As I looked through the participant list, understanding that probably some people were families joining in on one line together, I wouldn't say that we definitely did not have more than we normally would have had, and it could have even been a little bit less. So I've been a little surprised that it seems that we have not increased our attendance necessarily because of the ease of accessing it at home, but there could be other factors at play there.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add a couple of things. I think that you know, regardless of whether it was an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting, I think what we're learning that it was really important to kind of have that supplement to the actual meeting. So making sure, you know, that you have the information online and people can kind of interact with that information kind of on their own terms and on their own timeline and provide that feedback in a timely way. I agree, and I touched on this. I think that we were a little bit surprised that the numbers weren't going to kind of immediately jump up because we had what we thought was a captive audience from a virtual meeting standpoint. But at the end of the day, when they're sitting on their couch, you're competing with Netflix and Hulu and all those other things. And so the distractions are there. And, you know, for a lot of people, it's you know, a survive kind of moment for them. And so, you know, the things that they're not going to engage with are, you know, potentially, you know, long range planning processes. They're kind of, their mindset is more in the now.
Great, thank you for that. Stephen asks, and this is specifically to T, how much was budgeted for the mailing and production of the postcards, and did you think it was worth the cost? Did the benefits outweigh the cost that was spent? And I think, T, you noted in the chat box that it was around $3,500.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's actually tough to quantify whether or not it was worth the cost. If you're looking strictly at the number of postcards that were returned to the mailboxes, that number was relatively low. But if you look at the awareness, the overall awareness that was generated, and how it was able to drive folks to the website, to the surveys, to those sort of, you know, digital engagement platforms, you know, I think you might be able to make an argument for it. You know, and Jonathan mentioned the digital divide, and a lot's been sort of written about that recently. And so, you know, keeping in mind that not everyone has a smartphone or a laptop, that's important. And I feel like we're kind of experimenting with different ways to engage people affordably in those sort of analog methods. So, yeah, I mean, if we were going to do it all over again, you know, we may not have sent out those just due to the cost. Whereas the little like snipe signs, those actually are very cost effective, and folks are accustomed to seeing those up in their communities, especially as they relate to a planning process, usually a rezoning. So anyway, I hope that answers the question. I mean, the short answer is it's kind of tough to tell. It's not an overwhelming yes. It was worth it though.
I think T's hitting on something really important there, and that's the challenge that comes with calculating the amount of awareness that those postcards generated, right? Because that awareness is critical for a planning process. And so a lot of times when we talk numbers about engagement, we talk about touch points. How many people did we reach with the planning process and gave them the opportunity to engage? Some people are going to engage regardless. They're the civically obsessed. They're coming. They've got their motive and they're going to engage. For others, they're likely not to engage regardless. So just kind of that act of making them aware and giving them the opportunity is really all that you can do. So I think in T's case, celebrating the fact that they did mail several thousand of those postcards is information that should be communicated to elected officials in the community overall.
Good points. As planners, I think we always look for more opportunities to engage the public, and even though many communities are going virtual out of necessity, I think virtual meetings will become an additional tool that we as planners will be using from here on to provide more opportunities for individuals to become engaged in the local planning process. So I thank all of you for your time today. I really do appreciate it. This is a lot of information within an hour time frame. It's a lot of details and a lot of information that I think is good for a number of communities in the upstate. So thank you once more. As we conclude, I have one update I'd like to bring to your attention. We are working, 10 at the top is working with the Upstate Planners Group on an updated comprehensive plan analysis. Barry Knox and his class at Clemson University reviewed the comprehensive plans for the 10 upstate counties in 2014. And over the last 7 years, many of the plans have changed. So we've reached out once again to Clemson to look to update this information and determine commonalities between these plans, where we can build engagement around and look for those common threads between each of those plans. If you're interested in this project, please reach out to me, Michael, or Dean, and we would be happy to plug you in to that process. But that's what we'll be looking at over the next couple months. And as we get forward, looking forward towards our next quarterly meeting sometime in the early fall. So we'll let you know what's the status of that as it gets a little bit closer to time. Michael or Justine, do you have anything else?
Nope, just want to thank everybody for their time. We do appreciate it, and we just want everybody to stay safe.
Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.